Hello, welcome to the Bluff Books podcast. This is #BluffBooks, the show that's all about building, leading, and understanding financial freedom. So whether you're an average Joe seeking financial well-being and independence, or a fiduciary advisor who seeks to connect with average Joe, thank you for joining me on this show as we discuss books relating to the topic of financial literacy. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can continue to enjoy a new episode with me every week. I'm your host, Ian Gates, a former Spanish teacher and U.S. Army intelligence officer, but now I'm an aspiring financial advisor because as a teacher and an intel officer, my soldiers and my students constantly had financial questions, and when they'd ask me, I'd have to say, I don't know, I have to look that up too. And so the show's name comes from the military acronym BLUF, which stands for Bottom Line Up Front. It means that here I seek to always present the most important information right at the start in the clearest, most engaging way possible. Like my hero LeVar Burton of Reading Rainbow fame, my goal is to encourage a love of reading, and for this show to be a springboard, not a stopping point for your engagement with these texts. And please remember, this is a radio show, so we can only discuss concepts in terms of general truths and tendencies. It is for educational purposes only and is not financial advice. Thank you, and let's start the show. This episode includes a frank discussion of slavery and might not be appropriate for all listeners. We acknowledge that slavery is always evil and unjustified. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Bluff Books podcast. So I'm here with my guest, Clifton Corbin, who's an author and also the editor, or reviser, I should say, of a classic test, The Richest Man in Babylon, which was originally published Great Depression, and now, in the wake of the COVID pandemic, we needed a version that was more appropriate at the time. But welcome, Clifton.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this chat.
Yeah, so one of the things that impressed me at the beginning was the fact that it was a collaborative effort with your son, and getting to do that together, I'm sure, was a bonding experience, and also probably helped, too, with having his insight into what his peers would and would not find appealing to read.
Yeah, so I can give you the backstory on how I ended up working on it with him, just to give you a bit of sense of how that even came to be. So my son at the time was 10, and The Richest Man in Babylon has always been a favorite book of mine. So I wanted to read it to him, but quickly I realized it just wasn't it wasn't making any sense to him. His eyes got all glazed over, and he's like, I don't know what you're saying. And I realized, yeah, this book is, as much as it's a classic and it's been so foundational to so many people to help with their finances, it's dated. It was written back in 1926, so it's done its purpose, but it needed a little refreshing. So with him as my sounding board, I would read a little bit to him, and once he gave me that I don't know what you're talking about look, I would revise what I read to him, and then I would read it back to him, and if it made sense, then I would keep it in. So it was a very collaborative process, which was nice. And a lot of people say, you need to be writing in plain language at a grade 5 level, which was ideal because at the time he was in grade 5. So it worked out really, like you said, it was a great process. And having him, who, he's been my sounding board since I started advocating for financial literacy. So he's not coming from it from a place of total lack of knowledge, but having him there just to kind of give me that reassurance that I'm staying true to the story and staying authentic to the narrative style of the book, and all the while making it a little bit more fresh and modern it was a great experience. And yeah, I was able to connect with him and kind of hopefully get it to a level where his peers will be able to enjoy it as well.
What sayest thou, Father, forsooth? Yeah, reading the original, I definitely found a bit of that King James Bible-type language, which I think was in part an effort to appeal to the original audience who would have been raised on things like the Arabian Nights and not Disney's Aladdin. But it is a challenge when you undertake modernizing a text. How do you make it approachable so that it continues teaching without making a barrier to really appreciating the historical context of the book? And I'm curious, whose idea was it to gender swap characters?
So that was me. That was all me. So when I decided I wanted to go down this path of modernizing, I realized one of the reasons I did it, and like I said, I recognized it pretty quickly when I started reading it from the eyes of a father, as opposed to just me reading it as an individual male doing his thing. But when I read it as a father, I was like, my daughter isn't represented in this text. I am as a male, but my daughter wasn't. And I was like, that's such a huge part of the population. And when I say she wasn't represented, I mean, like, every character, for the most part, every object, every animal had a he, him pronoun. And I was like, it would be really nice to have this be a little bit more diverse in the character set. So I wanted to make sure that as I modernize just the language, that I'm also modernizing the perspective. And one of the reasons I love the book so much is that, in addition to being just like a great book to teach financial literacy, a lot of the themes in the book are around mentor-mentee relationships. So I really wanted to capture that and show that relationship can be between a wiser person, and their gender really isn't a factor, right? If they've been doing the right things, if they've learned the habits of saving and investing, the gender doesn't really come into it. But when you read a text that was written so long ago, and it's written in a way, like you said, that King James style or what have you, when it's written in that way and all the characters are masculine, it starts to compound the complexity. It starts to make it even harder for people, or it made it hard for me just to read and enjoy it when I kept seeing, like, why are the camels boys? Like, it just seemed weird, right? Like, it's just not how we speak anymore. And it's not how we typically try to write a text. And to the point that you made earlier, I was lucky in that the book is a fiction. Like, as much as it is written as a historical text of Babylon, it's a fiction. So I didn't need to worry too much about making a mistake with the historical references, since some of the references are very accurate and apt, because Clason was a classics major, so he studied classical culture. So he was very, very knowledgeable of the area and the people in the area. So some of it's true to the reality of the time, what he knew about the times. But some of it's just fiction. So I wasn't too worried about changing anything with regards to damaging the historical pieces. And I even put a little disclaimer to say I didn't try to modernize the facts of the places or the people or the culture. That wasn't my intent. It was really just to try to make the language a lot more accessible, and then also try to represent a broader spectrum of people in the text, so that we saw more of modern day society in that text, even though it's supposed to be a historical book.
Absolutely. And again, when I watched the movie Mulan by Disney, I'm not taking that as gospel truth of what happened in ancient China.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably wearing clothes that are 300 years too soon and using weapons that are 300 years too late. But that's not really the point of the text. And representation is important. And the book was written in a context where husbands and fathers ruled supreme over their household in an economic sense. And at least in the United States and over Europe and Canada, it wasn't until the 1970s that a woman could have a credit card in her own right without having a man in her life as a co-signer. That was 40 years before now, and Richest Man was about 40 years before the 70s. So it was definitely overdue, because I shiver to think about my daughter being left financially unaware and maybe even potentially the victim of financial abuse because she wouldn't know what was going on with the money in the household.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I also, and I've had this feedback as well, and I don't mean to say that if anyone sees the cover of my book, crossed out Richest Man and added person instead, again, to try to highlight that I'm trying to make it more inclusive. And I'm not trying to say that just because the protagonist or the characters were male, that someone who's not male can't identify with them. But I did want to try to create a text that was more inclusive, and try to not just represent a diverse audience, but just make sure that if you're reading it, you could see both yourself, no matter who you were in the text. I think I hit the mark, but that was my goal in going about changing some of the characters and changing their genders in the book.
Definitely, and there's always the slings and arrows of purists when you undertake such a thing. But again, with those texts, it's adapt or die. Those texts need to take on a life of their own. Though, we've all watched film adaptations where we feel like they either improved upon the original or they kind of squashed it. But sometimes there are things that you just can't take out because otherwise the work loses its power. And that was one of the things that was very interesting to see was how do we confront the reality of slavery in this text when it's deeply uncomfortable. I would say it's probably the world's second oldest profession. Not that anybody wants to participate. And even today, it's a problem. So how do we confront that and also recognize that it's super important, I think, for the text to use that word because financial bondage is no joke.
Yeah, so I would hesitate to call it a profession, but I take your point in that it's been around since probably time immemorial. What I tried to do, and a brief story. So recently, you and I, we've met via a conference that occurred in New Orleans. I was lucky enough to go on a tour with this one lovely woman who gave a tour of the city, and she talked a lot about the culture and history of New Orleans. And while she was giving the tour, and she would mention how the city was basically built by and was mainly used by slave owners, and anytime she would mention slavery or slaves, she would use air quotes. And at one point, someone during the tour asked, why are you using air quotes around the word slaves? Like, what's happening here? And she's like, well, they were enslaved. They did not volunteer to become slaves. They were enslaved. Like, the language has changed to show the power dynamic that occurred around these acts. So I tried to do that as well with my text. So instead of just using the word, these were slaves, they were enslaved people. Some of the text where I could, I did try to, if it was possible, to talk about the relationship without using slavery, the institution of slavery. I did. Some of it you couldn't. Like you said, it was too tightly bound to the story. And you're right. Some of it isn't. It's using slavery or enslavement as a metaphor, an allegory to talk about financial bondage, which is when you do not feel like you have control of your money, but your money is controlling you, whether that be via debts or just not having enough to pay your bills or whatever it might be. So it was necessary to keep some of that in, but again, modernize the language to again demonstrate that there is a dynamic here that is not voluntary, it is not asked for, it is definitely one person oppressing another person, and using that language and then being sensitive to it. I did mention it in my editor's notes, like this is a sensitive subject. It is not something that anyone is eager to be like, hey, let's talk about this, but it is something that was part of the original text and was foundational to the original text, because some of those stories, they just don't make any sense if we don't have the institution of slavery in there. So I had to keep it for those stories. For others, like I said, if it was possible to remove it without damaging the story itself, then I did. It's just, again, using the language of the 21st century is a big part of it. We speak very differently now, and the reason we do that is to give people the respect they deserve given the circumstances they're in. So that's how I try to treat it, with dignity and with care, and when possible, acknowledge that it was there, and then when possible, remove it. I didn't want to totally wash it out of the story as well, because that would not do it justice, because this is, again, as you mentioned, it's an old institution. It definitely occurred during Babylon. It occurred differently than what we might have experienced in like the 20th century or 21st. It's different, but it was still something that had to be included, just had to be treated a little differently than it was when it was originally written.
Absolutely. It reminds me of how the people of Budapest in Hungary confronted the reality of all of their Soviet-era statues of people like Lenin and Marx, and seeing all these things in the middle of their plazas all over their cities. They said, these are works of art that people put a lot of effort into, and we can't pretend that we weren't oppressed by communism for all this time, but to keep them front and center in our plazas, just not appropriate either. And the solution they wound up doing was creating a sculpture park on the outskirts of the city where you can pay whatever the local currency is, and you can walk around, you can look at all these communist statues and busts and other things, and think about that time, think about what the artist was trying to convey, but at the same time, it's saying we're no longer more or less worshiping these things anymore.
You're changing, and that's a great example. You're not removing the thing, you're changing the context around the thing. So it's no longer this thing that again, I'm just going back to the book, it was used so, I don't want to say flippantly, but it was just kind of put out there, and there was no It just was, right? Like it was just kind of, the original text talks about slavery and enslavement in a way that there was obviously no consideration to the cultural sensitivities that would have still existed in 1920, which it is what it is. But given where we are now, I think I said your example is great, where we've recognized there's still something here, and we don't want to pretend it doesn't exist, because that doesn't serve anyone either, right? Like it doesn't serve us to say that was then, because then if we ignore history, we're bound to repeat it. So it's important to keep it, but put the context around it to recognize what it is, what it was, and hopefully speak about it in a way that's a little bit more dignified, if that's a way, if I could even say that.
Certainly, and it is a biblical proverb that the borrower is slave to the lender, in that there is this dehumanizing aspect of being on the hook for a loan you cannot repay, especially a loan without collateral. You know, if you can sell that car and get out from under it, that's one thing, but if you're underwater on that car or that house, like we saw after the crash of '08, it's very real oppression that you face in that circumstance.
And it's interesting because you say that, and I 100% agree with you. When I think about the original text, a lot of the times where I was able to kind of pull the slave master metaphor out of the story is not on what we owe our creditors or as a debtor. It was often when talking about investing and how earning money is our slave working for us. And I was like, sure, but that I don't like. I just couldn't keep that in, right? Like it, and it would again. The original text would talk about how you save, a gold piece, and that gold piece's children, after earning interest, will then work for you, and that will then work for you. But again, using that same enslavement montage of wording, and I was like, I can't keep it. Didn't serve a purpose really when you think about it there. Like when we're talking about it now with regards to how you feel when you're indebted, it makes more sense there, and that's why the stories where it's talking about debt, you still see that theme there. But when we're talking about investing and earning and using money to make more money, I didn't need to keep it there. So those are the spaces where you saw me remove it.
Absolutely. And looking at the rules for managing gold and the means of carrying a lean purse, I mean, those rules are so persistent throughout time, and the issue of what happens when you eat the seed corn, what happens when you give up your free agency for things that really aren't worth it. And I love how he talks about in the class that the king asks him to put on, because it's a civic issue. It's not just a personal issue. And that's why the king asks Arkad, the richest man in Babylon, to start giving financial literacy classes, because it is a net negative when only a small amount of people know how to manage their resources. And I know you worked in the public sector in the government in and around Toronto, and I worked in the U.S. government trying to keep U.S. soldiers from letting their credit and financial issues run amok. And I'm curious to see how some of these examples have borne out in your own work helping educate others.
Oh, it's interesting. So a lot of times when I'm talking financial literacy, especially when I'm talking about parents and kids, which is kind of where I focus my attention, I've noticed a lot of times one of the things, we talk about it often, but it can get missed in the financial literacy education stream. And it comes back to donating and sharing some of the wealth that you have. And it kind of goes back to that idea of being civically minded, similar to what you were just saying, right? Like the part in the story that you're referencing is basically the city is struggling because wealth is held within the hands of very few. I don't know if that resonates with anyone right now. I think it would. And the idea is if we can teach these lessons, these timeless lessons, then the wealth will grow and it will be spread amongst many. Like I said, when I talk to parents, when I talk to kids, I try to bring that up. We need to do all of the fundamentals, right? We need to pay ourselves first. We need to make sure we're saving and investing the parts that we don't spend. We need to make sure we've protected our wealth. All of those pieces are critical. But again, the idea of donating and being civically minded and thinking about there will always be people that we can help and serve. And that, when I say donate and give, talking about resources, yes, but resources can come in the form of your time, your effort. It can come in the form of money, but being aware that we have a duty to do some service, to think not just of ourselves and growing our wealth, whether that be financial wealth or the wealth of having family and all the things that we are appreciative of. We should also be trying to do something to give some of that to others. So I see a big parallel there between that one piece of thinking about how I could teach, because again, Arcad does not ask for anything to start giving these lessons, because he realizes by giving of the knowledge that he has, he will cause a greater good. And it's something that I've tried to absorb. It's why I enjoy speaking with people like yourself and parents and parent groups. And it's why I do what I do, is because I get a lot of joy out of it, yes, but it's also a way to share knowledge, because I know that is a way to spread the wealth of whether that be knowledge or resources. So I see that parallel, and I try to tap into that when I'm talking to other people.
Absolutely. One of my favorite things about financial literacy education, and that's borne out in the book, is the idea that give a man a fish, you'll feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you'll feed him for a lifetime. Like the story of Arcad's son/daughter, depending on your version of the original. The next generation person, Nomasir, Nomasira, initially is focused on the money, the small pot of gold for traveling and adventure, and only after she has fallen on hard times are they ready to read the clay tablets and to really employ that knowledge. And another thing that I love in the book with the last story is the luckiest man in Babylon. He pays it forward and educates a friend, and that friend winds up buying him out of an especially terrible bondage situation. And I think the only thing more noble than keeping yourself out of bondage is rescuing others from it. And that friend doesn't rescue the guy simply he rescues him out of the good of his heart, but he also says, I'd love you to be my business partner.
Mm-hmm.
Winds up paying dividends to the rescuer's own grandson, who's a bit spoiled. When his grandpa's still living business partner explains why they're doing what they're doing, what are his roots, what are the real values that will actually matter.
Yeah, it's a theme that runs throughout the whole book, the idea of paying it forward from the second chapter all the way to the end. And I mentioned it earlier, that mentor-mentee relationship, which is so fundamental to, well, I think growth in general. But if you look at almost all of the stories, they all have this aspect of, I have something valuable, and it's usually not just the money, it's usually the knowledge on how to acquire it and how to maintain it and how to grow it, and I want to share that. Almost everyone felt, in all those stories, you can see almost everyone feels compelled to share that knowledge. And it's the knowledge is obviously the riches of Babylon, right? That's the piece that everyone is trying to make sure that they pass on, because the money, it will come and hopefully it will last for generations. But if that knowledge doesn't pass on, then it won't. So it's a constant pay it forward in each one of the stories, which is why I think, in general, I think that's why the book resonates with so many people, because I think inherent in most of us is that desire to serve and to learn, and obviously to grow our wealth. And if you can combine all of those into some short, easy to read, easy to understand stories, it's why the richest man in Babylon, or the richest person in Babylon, if you're looking at my version, has stood the test of time. It's fun to read. It talks about how I can help my brother, sister, friend, cousin, what have you, not by giving them something, by giving them a loan, but by giving them the knowledge to make sure that when they earn, they know what to do with it, so that they can have more when they earn the next time, and over again. And I love that. That's the reason I'm so passionate about the story, is because it's just a wonderful version of how do we help our neighbor.
Thank you so much, Clifton, for coming on the show, and I'm excited to see the later titles that you put out, and I'm excited also to eventually read your kids Their Money.
Oh, I'm excited for you to read that one too.
Yeah, I got a 4-year-old son and a 2-year-old daughter, and I'm just trying to continually remind them of the things that matter and just give it to them a little bit at a time. And by the time they're grown and flown, if they haven't learned it already, they'll remember it when life hits them upside the head.
That's the idea. And if you're looking for free resources for those little ones, I've got some free downloadable workbook, lots of fun money games and money activities. You can get it at kidsmoneyworkbook.com. So hopefully the little ones will enjoy those.
CliftonKaleb.com.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on.
Likewise. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Bluff Books podcast. We look forward to you joining us again as we continue to explore the world of finance, investing, and wealth building by reading new and classic books pertaining to financial literacy. And please remember, this is a radio show, so it's for educational purposes only and is not financial advice. But if you need financial advice that is relevant to your unique personal situation, please consider hiring a certified financial planner who works on a fee-only basis. The big ideas I cite here from the books are based on my interpretation of the texts, and I look forward to hearing from you and engaging with you on your thoughts and recommendations. You can best reach me by joining the hashtag BluffBooks group on LinkedIn or emailing me at ian.gates12@outlook.com. And remember, here at hashtag BluffBooks, we cite sources, keep it brief, treat others with respect, use humor, promote freedom, and of course, don't bury the lead. Take care, guys.